Hey, y'all, and welcome to the first short lecture from chapter 4 in your textbook. And here we're going to speak a little bit about the human relations school and its relationship to organizational communication. So, the human relations school is one that focuses primarily on the social aspects of work. So, people who are interested in this school of thought look at instead of looking at things like how for example, in our previous lectures, we discussed how people looked at things like how motion could be controlled in order to increase efficiency. We looked at various ways, schools of thought that employed scientific management in order to effectively lead and control organizations. But people in the human relations school are interested in much more interested in sort of the human aspect of, hence the name, right? In the human aspect of work. So scientific management, which we talked about previously, was all about controlling the body of the worker. It was all about how tasks were performed, right? Then when we talked about the bureaucratic school, we talked about the way bureaucracy controls through a series of impersonal rules and regulations. With the human relations school, we're looking at how workplace control is achieved by paying attention to the attitudes, feelings, and relational concerns of workers. So, in this school of thought, managers are actually interested in what the employees are feeling and what they're thinking. So, again, this is much more focused on sort of the emotional or human aspect of employment. So, unlike scientific management and bureaucratic control, human relations recognizes the importance of informal communication. So what this means when we talk about informal communication, we're talking about the ways that people in a workplace relate to each other in sort of their everyday activity, right? We're not interested so much in memos or edicts or rules or workplace manuals. We're interested in how people really communicate in the workplace, workers amongst themselves, workers and the management, and so on, how they actually communicate. Because in reality, that makes up much more of the work environment than the sort of idealized or bureaucratic models that we see in these other lines of thinking. So to give you a little context about how this emphasis on sort of the emotional and informal side of work came to be, during the late 19th and early 20th century, we saw a lot of what your book calls authoritarian and coercive working conditions. So what this means in plain English is that a lot of people went to jobs that were really hard. And they went to jobs that were really hard where they were tightly controlled by management, and frankly, many of the workers were taken advantage of. And people, the workers, they realized this. And so we saw during this time period a lot of organized action against factory owners. So workers realized that they were working in inhospitable or negative conditions and tried to do something about it. So what we see is that during the brief time between 1881 and 1905, there were 37,000 strikes, so 37,000 instances of workers striking. These strikes involved 7 million workers, and that's out of a total U.S. workforce of only 29 million people. So that means that almost a quarter of American workers during this period of time went on strike because of their working conditions. Now, all of this sort of came to a head through two sort of tragic events. The Ludlow Massacre and the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. Now, these events are detailed in these videos, and I encourage you to watch the videos in your own time. They're not that long, but I'll give you a little bit of background on each in the meantime. So the Ludlow Massacre occurred during the early part of the 20th century, and it occurred out west where a bunch of miners working for J.D. Rockefeller went on strike to protest bad mining conditions, bad working conditions. And as a result, they set up a tent city where they lived with their families, and they were striking and protesting the work. Rockefeller, in response, got together with the state government and brought in the National Guard. And when the National Guard came in, the workers, the strikers, thought they were there to help them, and they cheered them, only to find out that they were there, in essence, working for Rockefeller, and this all eventually led to them being massacred, being machine gunned to death in their tent homes. So men, women, children, families, and so on were murdered because they were looking for better working conditions, right? The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory took place in New York City in 1914, if I recall correctly. And this was a factory where they made women's blouses, and there were about 500 young immigrant women working in really poor conditions that were turning out these blouses, right? Very quickly and working very hard. And a fire started one day inside the factory, spread very quickly, and the safety precautions just weren't there, right? There were insufficient fire escapes, doors were locked and so on, preventing them from getting out. And as a result, 146 people died in the fire because of poor working conditions. So these two events really kind of showcased poor working conditions in the United States, and it showed what a bad deal the workers were getting. And so as a result, this led to a greater interest in the human side of work and labor relations. So after these major events, we saw a whole bunch of social reform movements begin in the United States. This was only accentuated by increasing production demands due to World War I. Right, so the United States enters into World War I, and all of a sudden we need to make all kinds of stuff for the military effort in our factories. And so as a result, even more people went to work. They worked even harder, and reformers looked at this and said, listen, these workers need to have some rights. We need to give them some rights so that they're not just exploited to the point where it's truly unethical, right, immoral. After World War I, we began to see an increasing focus on the part of these reformers on addressing inequalities of wealth. So this is a problem even today, right? But this time period was very similar, right? During the Gilded Age, we saw the same sort of economic inequality in many ways that we see in the United States today. So all of this combined leads to an increased interest in democracy. And within this context, there are two camps that evolve. The first camp is made up of what we call industrial Democrats, led primarily by John Dewey. These folks wanted increased levels of worker participation in industrial decision making. So they wanted workers to have more say over their own working conditions and a more active role in the management of the company that they work for. Then another group, there was another group known as the Realist Democrats, and these were led by Elton Mayo, who we'll talk about in the next short lecture. And Mayo said that the administrative elites, the people in charge, should take the lead in policy decisions. So in other words, the managers, the owners, the industrialists, the people in charge, they should make the decisions, right? And as you probably realize by now, the realists won the day, right? Their way of thinking won out and continues to be the dominant mode of thinking in the U.S. today, right? Okay, so that was a quick one. But next time we'll talk a little bit about Elton Mayo, a little bit more about Elton Mayo, and specifically some work he did known as the Hawthorne Studies. All right, thanks for checking this out.